So, welcome for this session of our Monday seminar. Today we have the pleasure and honor to welcome here Professor Elisabeth Engdahl from Göteborg to give a talk in this FJelinekSeries of lectures. We are really happy that you could accept the invitation to come and talk to us. Personally, I would say there are two reasons for that, or maybe three. One, of course, is the topic, because discourse is now a topic which is, I would say, deeply and extensively studied. So it's something which we really would like to hear your position on that topic. And second, that there is another personal link, actually. Not only that one of our stays within the Tempus program was in Edinburgh, and we were pleased by the hospitality of Professor Engdahl and her husband, Robert Cooper, when they were at Edinburgh, but also that we have a common friend, I would say, and that's Barbara Hall-Partee. Elisabeth, if I am... as far as I know, studied at Stockholm, her master's studies, but then he had her PhD studies at Amherst, and under the guidance of Barbara Partee. And after then, you went from one place to another, very important places actually, and highly prestigious places. And then for 10 years you were in Edinburgh at the School of Cognitive Science, or
yep.
Okay. And that was the place where we were invited for the Tempus exchange after 89. From there, you went to Göteborg, and you are there until now, and you are at the Department of Swedish. So, I also know from the history of linguistics, so to say, that Elisabeth is one of the protagonist of the study of parasitic gaps. And also I remember that people refer to her as one of the best connoisseurs of modern syntactic theories. If you haven't heard that, I did. So so I mean, as you see, there are many reasons why we wanted to have Elisabeth with us. It's not her first stay. I remember your stay during the Esley summer school. Also during Mathesius
twice
series. Okay.
Twice during Mathesius. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that was the time of the syntactic theories, I remember. And so we are very happy to have you here, and we are looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. On my part, I'm very happy to get the opportunity to talk about this topic, strategies for cohesive dialogues in Scandinavian, precisely here in this seminar, because I'm pretty sure that these matters have been discussed more here and thought about more here than maybe in any other place that I know of. So it's with some trepidation that I'm going to show you what happens in spontaneous dialogues in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. Those are the mainland Scandinavian languages. I don't have any data from Icelandic or Faroese here. It would have been too much, I think. And since these languages are quite not so familiar, I've also made a handout, so you have all the examples with glosses on the handout. Right, so yes, as I said, with some trepidation, I'm going to talk about thematic progression in the sense of Danish in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish dialogues. My main point is that preposing something to initial position, something that's not the subject, is a strategy that is consistently used for discourse cohesion. I'm going to do a few comparisons with English, German, and Dutch. Unfortunately, not with Czech, but maybe you can enlighten me afterwards. I'm mainly going to talk about preposing of light pronouns, but I'm also going to bring up some data on prepose clauses, and finally a little bit on Rheem preposing. Okay, so as Eva mentioned, my husband is British. We have a lot of contrastive linguistics going on at the kitchen table. But not only with him, but in general, I've noticed that when you compare English and Scandinavian dialogues, they differ. So here is your first Swedish example. När köpte du din första bil? And B1 says, den köpte jag 1980. Let's see if I can work this. Yes. So this is a pronoun, den, which refers back to the antecedent. Oops. It's very sensitive. And I've underlined the antecedent of the pronoun. So the underline is always the antecedent of a pronoun in the second utterance. You could answer as in B2, jag köpte den 1980. But that's just not so common. B1 is the common way. Now, if I just translate this into English, when did you buy your first car? The unmarked answer is, I bought it in 1980. You definitely don't say, it I bought in 1980. You can say, that I bought in 1980, with a certain amount of stress on the initial demonstrative pronoun, that. But the hash mark here means that I consider that this is not an entirely natural answer in this context, because the question is about a single car, your first car. And if you answer, that I bought in 1980, you almost expect a continuation, like, and my second car I bought in. You evoke like a set of cars, and you're saying something about the first one. But that you don't find in the Swedish example. Next, we have an example from Norwegian. It's an interviewer who asks a dialect speaker, hvordan var språket här? Har det förändrat sig? How was the language? Has it changed? And the B answers, nej, det vill jag inte si. No, it will I not say. Where it goes back to the whole question, has the language changed? Oops. And again, in English, if you ask the same thing, has it changed? I think A would be an unmarked answer. No, I wouldn't say so. Again, I don't think you could say B, no, so I wouldn't say, but you don't. And you definitely don't say no, so wouldn't I say. So in Norwegian, you get the verb in the second position, but you can't do this here in English. Right. So this was the reason for starting this investigation. And I'm mainly interested in when you prepose object pronouns. And by preposing, I here mean putting something into initial position that isn't a subject. And to study this, I did this study together with a PhD student, Filippa Lindahl. We decided to use the methods from Prague, especially Danish. And so I'm going to use theme as the starting point of an utterance, Rheem, the intonational and communicative center. And I assume you're all more familiar with this tradition than I am. I recently read Eva's paper from 2012 and learned and followed how the ideas are traced from the Ver and Mathesius. Okay, so this will be a short, just how we applied Danish's three types to our data. So the first type, where the Rheem of the first utterance becomes the theme of utterance 2. In the literature, this is also known as focus chaining or switch topic, in the sense that you're not keeping the same topic as in the preceding utterance. I will call these Rheem topic chaining, just to be very explicit, that the Rheem in the initial utterance is picked up by the topic, the initial constituent in the second utterance. Continuous themes, where the theme of the first utterance remains in the subsequent utterances. Erteshikshir calls this topic chaining. I'll call it a topic chain. And the third type, which Danish calls derived theme, where something that is introduced by a hypertheme, which could be a heading or a complex Rheem, and it's then expanded by a sequence of themes. So an example would be, I noticed a couple sitting on a bench, where that's the Rheem, a couple sitting on a bench, and the following utterance is, the man I'd never seen before, but the woman looked familiar. So here we have two derived themes. The first one, the man, is preposed, and the second one in subject position. But both have contrastive stress, and you have this, the couple introducing the set, and then picking up each of the members of the set. These are, Enric Valdovi refers to this function, this discourse function, where you sort of introduce new reference that have a common mother node, so to speak, as a link. Another term is contrastive topic, and that then zeroes in on the fact that you often have a stress, and it seems to imply the existence of alternatives. Okay, I need to say something about basic clause structure as well. English, as you all know, is basically a subject initial language. You can have a topic before the subject, but it's rather marked. So I like beans is sort of the vanilla sentence. Beans I like is rather marked, and you have to have stress on the first constituent. In verb second languages, and Scandinavian we could also call them North Germanic, I think it's better to talk about the verb in declarative sentences is in second position, and before that you have like a slot for whatever. It could be the subject, as in I like beans, jag gillar bönor. Or it could be a preposed object, det gillar jag. I like it. It I like, it like I. And you can also have, just like in English, bönor gillar jag, but notice the verb follows immediately. Some terminology for the initial position, and by that I mean exactly the position, not the function of the position. In current minimalism, it could be, depending on how many functional projections it can be, but let's call it spec CP. In the German syntactic tradition, it's often called a Vorfeld. But before Vorfeld sort of made it as the standard term, for a while the term was Basis, which I think is quite interesting, the base of the sentence. That was picked up in the Scandinavian tradition, where it was called Fundament, which means foundation. And in the recent Swedish Academy grammar, the term is Satsbasis, so the base for the clause. And that's a position where you can put lots of things, and then you have to identify both the grammatical function and the discourse function of what you have there. But I think it's important not to equate the initial position with a particular discourse function, as is done, for instance, in the cartographic approach. So, okay, now to our investigation. So Philippa and I were interested in when initial non-subject pronouns are used. And fortunately, there is now a rather large corpus of transcribed spontaneous dialects. Spoken, it's about 2.8 million words from about 800 speakers: Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, and Faroese. It's linked to audio and video, and it's transcribed in standard orthography, which means it's easy to search. And some of the speeches actually has a parallel semi-phonetic transcription as well. It's part of speech tagged, morphologically annotated, and partially lemmatized. And something that is actually a very nice feature, it comes with a Google Translate interface. So if you're not familiar with the languages, but you want to look for something and you get a number of hits, you can actually get an idea of what they mean. But it is not parsed. There are no tree banks for this corpus yet. And it's not annotated for discourse relations. So we had to work around that. We had done a previous study on the same material, just looking at object pronouns. Where do object pronouns show up? And found, to our surprise, that about half of them are preposed. So now we wanted to look closer at these object pronouns. So we searched lexically for all the forms of object pronouns, followed by a transitive verb, and then something which could be a likely subject. We limited ourselves to 8 common verbs, which often have animate subjects. We got a little over 5,000 hits, and that made a frequency of about 2 occurrences per 1,000 words, and the frequencies were similar in the 3 languages we investigated. And today I'm going to talk about a random selection we made of 150 hits, 50 from each language. So the first thing we did was to try to identify the antecedent of the initial pronoun in the context. And that wasn't very difficult. And then we decided on the type of discourse relation, the type of chaining. And we found that almost 2/3 were Rheem topic chaining, i.e. Fehrbach's basic thematic progression from Rheem to theme in the next sentence. Topic chains were also used, as well as some other types, which I will illustrate shortly. About a quarter of these happened across speakers. Okay, so the first Swedish example you saw is, of course, an instance of a Rheem topic chain. Here is an example of a topic chain. So this, they're talking about what happened in the forests between Norway and Sweden during the Second World War. And they're talking about, it's a woman, they're talking about a woman, they're saying that her husband was the father of the child. He was with the resistance and had been involved in some type of sabotage. So what I've done is I've just translated the preceding utterance into English, and then you have the relevant part in Swedish or Norwegian. So her husband becomes a topic. He's resumed. He was with the resistance. Sorry, there shouldn't have been any stress on that. He was with the resistance. And then comes, och honom hade de inte fått tag i, with the prepost, him, where in English you presumably would say they hadn't got hold of him. Another type, which was actually almost as common as the topic chaining, is illustrated here, and that is when the topic is introduced as a left dislocated phrase and then immediately resumed by a pronoun which has been preposed in its clause. So here a woman is talking about the toys they had when they were little. Sometimes you got some small thing, but we didn't have the money to buy a lot. Båtar, det gjorde jag ju själv, utav bark och trä och sådär. This is actually very common in Swedish. You introduce a topic, you resume it with a pronoun. That could be a subject pronoun, but quite often it's actually preposed from either the same clause or an embedded clause. And this actually quite often involves preposing an entire clause. So here another person is talking about how they used to go swimming in a river where there were grass snakes. The grass snakes swim faster than we do. We never learn. Och att vi inte drunknade, det förstår jag inte. And that we didn't drown, it understand I not. We'll come back to these in a little while. Okay, so we came up with the following characterization of the use of these initial pronouns. That a recently mentioned referent provides the starting point for the next utterance. And by using this preposed anaphoric pronoun, we have a way of chaining the utterances to each other. We also found some examples with dictic initial object pronouns. Here's from the Norwegian material. Someone is telling a story I'd asked where his bar was and wondered if there was anything that needed drinking up. And then Max pointed, and then he sort of says, ja, den vill jag inte ha, den vill jag inte ha, den vill jag inte ha, like that. And then, of course, there is an antecedent in the previous utterance, but it's clearly dictic. The most intriguing cases we found, and I wasn't aware of these until we did this systematic annotation, are cases where there is no antecedent preceding the utterance, but it turns out it's pointing forward. The antecedent comes later. So here a man is talking about safety helmets. So he works in the forests, and he's talking about the helmets and says they are, and interrupts himself and starts a new utterance and says, det vill jag säga. It won't I say. And the it is announcing, and then comes his message. Gå I skogen utan hjälm, det gör jag inte. Walk in the forest without a helmet, it do I not. And there you have another one of these left dislocated ones. So this is a series of. And we found quite a few of these. Sometimes it's difficult to tell what an de, the third person neuter pronoun, refers to. It's quite often underspecified. But when they were preposed and followed by an utterance like that, it's like they were announcing, expanding on the coming utterance. We also listened to how these pronouns were realized. And we found, I think, 3 levels, 3 types of phonetic realization. So here's a woman, she's retired, so she says, this winter I've taken a PC course. You think I'm crazy, right? She says to the audience, and then comments, men det har jag I alla fall, with clear stress on the verb. So I rendered it in English as, that's what I did anyway. And in that context, with that heavy stress on the verb, the initial pronoun det is reduced. The same woman, later in the conversation, the interviewer asks, what can you tell us about Halland? It's a region. And the lady starts by saying, det är väl, and I've marked this as det, just having ordinary word stress. And then she interrupts herself. She said, det är väl inte, and then says, no, and then says, det vill jag inte berätta något om. No, that I don't want to talk about. Where she clearly emphasizes, det vill jag inte prata om. And so there's a negation in the second utterance, and you get the impression that it's not that she doesn't want to continue talking. She's happy talking to the interviewer, but she can talk about other things. But that journey to Halland or something, she didn't want to talk about. So we did Praat analysis of some of these utterances. Now, this corpus is not ideal for doing phonetic analysis, since you can realize if you have 800 speakers, there is a lot of individual variation. But we did analyses of pronoun realization by the same speakers. So here we had the same speaker, and looked for a correlation between stress and discourse function. And the answer is, we couldn't find any direct correlation. It wasn't the case that Rheem topic chains were always more stressed than topic chains or anything. We looked, but there's nothing like that in the data. Instead, for Rheem topics and topics, the stress on the preposed pronoun is determined by the information structure of the rest of the utterance. And let me go back to, if I can. Here we go. Sorry, let's go back to this lady who says, "Det har jag I alla fall." So here she is emphasizing, it's a verum focus. I did this. And she's completely reduced the object here. Here, this I would say is a sort of an unmarked continuing intonation. But then when she resumes and says, "Nej, det vill jag inte berätta om," she does put emphasis on the first pronoun. So, and it's, as I said, negated, and then it's quite common that the preposed pronoun is stressed and interpreted contrastively. So here are two Pratt analyses showing exactly these utterances. This is the first one, the unstressed one, and I'm not sure you can read, but it's 50 milliseconds followed by this accented verb. And the second example, ne, det, you can actually see the prosodic gesture on det, and it's 3 times as long, it's 150 milliseconds. So this is quite noticeable, and I believe that the realization there is due to the information structure of the rest of that utterance. It has nothing to do with what type of chaining it's involved in. Let's briefly compare this with the situation in English. So I've already used this example to show that you don't prepose unstressed pronouns in English. And I think I can phrase it this way, that if you have a preposed phrase, i.e. not a subject but something else, you have to stress it, except for stage topics like then, there, these light adverbs which can be introduced. And since, I mean, I don't know what's the chicken and what's the egg here, but the fact that it's stressed means that it's interpreted contrastively, and you invoke another set of potential reference. Yes, this is what I just said. And this means that the unmarked realization for a Rheem topic or a topic in English is a subject. And we can go back to this example I had of a topic chain in Swedish. And just think about the English way to render this. Her husband was with the resistance, had been involved in some type of sabotage, so he's a topic. And I think what you would do is you continue by saying, and he was still on the run. Sorry, that was part of it, and he was still on the run. And then you say, and they hadn't got hold of him, with they being whoever was looking for him, another available topic here. You don't say as in see, and him they hadn't got. Let's see if I can try to say it. And him they, no, I can't even say it in English, right? You have to say, and him they hadn't got hold of. Which is not an appropriate message in that context, but that's precisely what you do in Swedish. I suspect that this difference here is partly due to the clause structure in English compared with the verb second languages. So in English, the topic position preceding the subject is not as well integrated with the rest of the clause. as in the verb second languages, where you have this position before the finite verb, and it's sort of part of the clause. And I think that's what enables the unstressed initial topics. And you don't find that in English. Okay, so let's look at what happens in some other verb second languages. Start with German. And here it's important to distinguish personal pronouns and demonstrative pronouns. And I'll call them D-pronouns. That's often done. Because in German, you make a distinction. So if you have a Rheem topic chain, i.e. one where the topic is not the same topic as in the preceding utterance, a switch topic context, you have to use a D pronoun, a demonstrative pronoun. It doesn't have to be stressed, but you choose from that inventory of pronouns. So here is the first example again in German. Wann hast du dein erstes Auto gekauft? You can answer, das habe ich in 1980 gekauft, with a D pronoun. You don't say, as in B, with the unstressed S. And there are severe restrictions on when you can prepose an S. And you don't need to stress it. I think if you say, das habe ich in 1980 gekauft, you get the same impression that you're expecting more information about the subsequent cars. Okay, and there is an interesting study by Bosch et al. Looking at written German, and they looked at the distribution of D pronouns and personal pronouns, and they found that 93% of the object D pronouns were preposed, and none of the personal pronouns. That's quite a... in Dutch, we also find a distinction between personal and D pronouns, and Jacqueline van Kampen has written about this quite a lot and claims that Dutch makes a systematic distinction that is used for referent tracking, knowing who you're talking about, so you switch between these two. And here, I won't read the Dutch example, my Dutch is not good, but it's parallel to what we just saw for German. You can prepose the object demonstrative pronoun, not the personal pronoun, and in this context it would be weird to stress it. And there is a relevant study by Gerlof Bauma, who looked at the spoken Dutch corpus and found only 4 preposed object personal pronouns compared to 2,700 preposed D pronouns. So you can see that this is clearly exploited in the language. The type of chaining, whether it's a Rheem topic chaining, matters for the way the subsequent utterance is formed. Okay. Recall that I talked about preposed clauses being rather common, and I'm coming back to them now, because I've talked a lot about preposed pronouns, but preposed clauses are actually very interesting. I mean, if you there are some tendencies for clause organization which are quite strong, which say you start with light elements and leave the heavy elements towards the end. But we were surprised at how many initial clauses we found. This is from a different investigation. Something like jag åker till Oslo nästa vecka. I'll go to Oslo next week. Men var jag ska bo där vet jag inte än. Now, so this is the preposed clause, where I will stay there. And notice that there is a proform there, which refers back to the Rheem of the preceding utterance. This is quite common in English as well. Here are two examples from the corpus of contemporary American. This one is really funny. In June 1997, a man fishing off the coast of the Falkland Islands was knocked unconscious and left comatose for 2 days after a frozen squid landed on his head. How the squid got there, nobody knows. So a frozen squid is introduced, and then comes a question relating to the squid. This is a rather long example with a preposed whether clause, which contains a demonstrative. Whether Mr. Hardy had witnessed this or not, I didn't know, but I suspected he had. And here the continuation is a contrast between not know and suspected. Okay, just to show that this is not, these preposed clauses are not special for the Scandinavian languages. They're used in German and English as well. And let's see how they fit with the thematic progression. I mean, they don't fit neatly because it's not that you're picking up a rheem or a theme from the preceding clause. Instead, the preposed clause often contains an expression that picks up the rheem or topic. So it's like you have this anaphor inside the preposed clause, which makes the connection with the preceding utterance, and raise a new issue, like how it got there, or where I will stay there, etc. New issues. Right. Now, one more comment on our Nordia Comp study. That was 11% of the preposed pronouns came from subordinate clauses. So here is another Norwegian example. A says, you conclude that Valdres is a good place. And B says, ja, det tror jag. Det tror jag tryckten kan se. So first he does a typical theme rheem topic chaining, and then he goes on. So this would be a topic chaining. But here the initial D is part of the embedded clause. And in English, I think you would say, I think one can safely say so. You wouldn't say, so I think one can safely say. This type of what I've called long distance preposing, i.e. it comes from an embedded clause, it's not just from that clauses. You find them also from embedded questions. Someone says, obviously it's been a party or something, look at all the pies that are left over. And B says, de vet jag inte vad vi ska göra med. Where the object comes from inside the embedded question, what we should do with. Another type is when you prepose from inside a relative clause. Johan suggested we should take a sauna. Och det var det väldigt många som ville. Where we have a kind of presentational cleft construction with a relative clause. Now here I've given some alternative translations into English, and I think B is what you would expect. And there were a lot of people who wanted to do that. You definitely don't say in English, and there were a lot of people who wanted to do. And you don't say, and that there were a lot of people who wanted to do. I mean, that's just, when I try this on English speakers, they just look at me and say, you're funny. So this type of preposing an object, a pronominal object, from inside a relative clause is actually quite common in Scandinavian, and it's something I've worked on earlier. Together with, or FJelinekSeries has similar data from Danish, and there is data from Norwegian as well. But what I've noticed in later years is that they're particularly common with pre-post pronouns. And Filippa Lindahl, my co-worker here, is preparing a dissertation where she looks at a large number of spontaneously produced preposings from relative clauses. And here's an example. It's a stand-up comedian who's talking about alcoholism. And then he quotes someone who expresses the opinion, the view that alcoholism is no illness, and then says his own comment, "Det stör jag mig på folk som säger." I get annoyed with people who say that, except that that is what he starts with. So he's sort of, this is again a Rheem topic chain. Now, when there's been quite a lot of discussion about these extractions, so-called, from relative clauses, and many researchers have claimed that, well, they're ungrammatical. They don't exist in English. They're very rare in English, and many people, starting with Ross, claim that they're actually ungrammatical, and that's interesting because it tells us something interesting about universal grammar. When I look at these spontaneously produced examples in Swedish, I think that what's going on here is that there's like a competition, and the drive to use preposing to establish this cohesion with the previous utterance is actually so strong that it outweighs any complexity that might arise from, going forward, pulling something out from inside an embedded question or a relative clause. So that's why it's very relevant to look at these pre-post pronouns. Okay, let's switch back from pronouns to pre-post clauses. And I call them expanding topics. It's like they are topics with respect, they contain a referent which was introduced in the preceding utterance, but they expand and introduce new issues. Here is an example about cosmic radiation. Some of the cosmic radiation makes the air glow, i.e. northern lights, I should say, so that the sky blazes with northern lights. And then comes the comment, men varifrån dessa strålar kommer är det ingen som vet. And in English you could say, but where this radiation comes from, no one knows. In Swedish you have an additional layer of embedding with the relative clause, but you don't really need that in the translation. So I think the pattern with prepost clauses is there in English as well. But English doesn't really allow for preposing from relative clauses. But since we know from the pronoun data that Swedish allows it, it's not surprising that we find even prepost clauses from relative clause, preposed from relative clauses. So what's going on here? Let's say that a way of characterizing the context for this example is to say that there is an issue that's up for discussion. Cosmic radiation makes the air glow. Let's call cosmic radiation, let's establish that as a discourse referent. It's been introduced. And what the second utterance then does is to express a potential question that can be raised with respect to cosmic radiation. Where does it come from? How does it look like? What does it look like? How is it going to affect us? And all of these would be good expanding topics in this context. And the link is precisely, so here we have cosmic radiation, and then we have a demonstrative with the same noun. So there's the referential link as well. I think I have one more example. This is from a blog, and there's a picture. You see a toy crocodile stuck in a mailbox. And the comment from the blogger is, hur han hamnat där, är det bara han som vet. It's a cleft construction. Okay, now I've talked about overt topics, but as you probably all know, some topics are so available that some languages just leave them out. And I think all the three languages I've spoken about allow for topics to be left out. In verb second languages, it's very easy to tell when a topic is left out, because then you start with the verb. And you don't do that otherwise in a declarative sentence. You do it in questions, but not in declarative sentences. So here's an example. This is a discussion about a ski race, and A says, men Johansson diskades ju. And the Swedish comment could be, visste jag inte, when that's new information. I didn't, right. In German, you do the same, wusste ich nicht. In English, I think you would say, I didn't know. And there is, of course, a zero there as well, but I've put that after the verb because it doesn't really make sense to say there's an empty topic before the subject, since I've tried to argue that you can only have something there if you emphasize it. And these kinds of seamless utterances, to use Feuerbach's term, they're definitely not stressed, right? You can't stress something which isn't there. Okay. I said I would mention a few, or say a few words about Rheem initial utterances. So far I've talked about chaining between Rheems or topics and initial topics. And those are definitely the most common. But lately I've been hearing quite a few Rheem initial utterances. So here are three types that I've come across. The first might be rather special for Swedish. I have to do some more work on this, but on board a sightseeing bus. And the woman sort of picks up the microphone and says, God morgon, Lisa heter jag och jag är värdinna idag. Starting with, she introduces herself, but she starts with her name. Instead of saying, in English you would clearly say, good morning, my name is Lisa and I will be your hostess today. And I think in German you wouldn't do this either, or I've checked with someone, you'd say, ich heiße Lisa und bin heute Ihre hostess. So this might be just a special way of introducing yourself, is that you give your name first. This happened in the waiting room in the clinic last week. an old woman who is supposed to fill in a form, and she gets someone else to do it, and then she says, as by way of explanation, jag ser dåligt på vänster öga, bara suddigt, hemskt är det. Let's do the English first then. So the lady complains, I can hardly see with my left eye, just blurred. And she then says, it's horrible, the fact that her eyesight is bad. In Swedish, the lady said, hemskt är det. Her assessment of the situation came first. And that you can do in German as well. Mit meinem linken Auge sehe ich schlecht, nur verschwommen. Furchtbar ist das. Furchtbar ist das. And they seem to be used characteristically when you express a feeling, an attitude, and you're almost like inviting the audience to commiserate with you or to agree with you. So it's a very, I wouldn't say that it's common, but it's used as a conversational routine to elicit support. This I heard on the radio. The interviewer asked, what do you think of his behavior? And the Swedish speaker says, pinsamt tycker jag att det är. German, this would be a case where you could, peinlich is one of these adjectives that you can prepose in German, but not out of an embedded clause. You could say, peinlich ist das, peinlich ist das, but not out of an embedded clause. So again, we see this difference between Swedish or Scandinavian on the one hand and German and Dutch on the other, that they're similar to some extent, but the Scandinavian languages allow for preposing out of embedded clauses to a wider extent. In English, I mean, this example is not very good, but there is this phenomenon that Ellen Prince has talked about. She calls it Yiddish Movement. Did you get wet? Bloody soaking I was. You should have a New York accent to make it better. Where it's like what you say here is at the top of a scale somehow. But I don't know enough about this Yiddish movement to be able to say anything here. I don't have any data myself. Okay, I think it's time for me to wrap up. The take-home message, in case you didn't already know, is that languages differ, maybe I should add, systematically in how they establish discourse cohesion. Because I think the patterns I've talked about today are conventionalized in the language use. And it's something that we need to be aware of for translation, of course, for dialogue systems, in particular, spoken dialogue systems, where the amount of stress and the intonation pattern on an utterance can mean, make the whole difference between something being a coherent answer and something being totally ununderstandable. I think it's important for speech recognition as well. If you have a speech recognizer who's sort of trained on initial subjects, which most speech recognizers are, and maybe on contrastive non-subject topics, and feed them the data from the Nordia Corp with all these unstressed initial objects, then you're in trouble. You get a lot of false interpretations. So for English, I've said that preposing is associated with contrast, and preposed phrases are interpreted as contrastive topics. other topics are normally realized as subjects, as Danish and others have written all along. And I think that Rheem preposing is highly marked, maybe only used by in New York. For German and Dutch, it's important to make a distinction between Rheem topic chains and other topic chains, since you have to use the demonstrative there, whereas topic chains are realized as personal subject pronouns. Rheem preposing occurs in simple clauses and in mainland Scandinavian. We've seen that both of these chains tend to involve preposing as long as we're talking about pronouns. You can, of course, stress an initial pronoun, but only if it's motivated by the information structure of the rest of the sentence, not because it's in that position. And we've seen that long-distance preposing is more common than in German and Dutch. And finally, this what I think is maybe the connection between the preposing data we've talked about today and the other fact about the mainland Scandinavian languages, namely that you find extractions much more freely than in others. In fact, I'm not aware of spontaneous extractions in other languages. There are lots of linguistic papers using constructed examples and have tests getting people to judge constructed examples, but I don't know of any collection of spontaneously produced ones, whereas they're easily found in Scandinavian conversations. Okay, that's the end.
Thank you very much. There are, I think, several points in what you have said that we also were concerned with in our study of the focus and the cohesion and the what we call the hierarchy of innovation and how the discourse proceeds. So it was very nice to see the differences and commonalities. So I would like to open the floor for discussion.
I agree with everything you've said. I'd only have one question about sentence number 6.
Yep.
Are you sure there is no contrast to someone, either the wife of the person in question or another person who were caught before?
I'm pretty sure, because, and this is not the only example we have. We have, I don't know, maybe a dozen examples like this. And I've also checked it with some Norwegian speakers. Sometimes, even a fairly unstressed initial pronoun can invite the inference that there is a contrast set. But that's why I picked this example, because they're just talking about this woman and her husband.
So you can never say it's an evidence for contrastiveness.
So we also have several examples with contrastive stress on the preposed pronoun. But we can show in the Pratt analyses that they are realized in a different way.
Mm-hmm. How would they be realized then?
Since we're not phoneticians, we've measured duration. And as I showed with the Swedish minimal pair there, the contrastively stressed pronouns are on an average 3 times longer than the unstressed ones.
So the written form would be the same? It would only differ in pronunciation?
Not necessarily. And there are some spoken forms you can actually make a lexical distinction between stressed and unstressed pronouns in some dialects in Norwegian. I have a reference for this which I will retrieve later and give to you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And in Swedish, would it be? Would it have been the same? So this was this was a Swedish sentence. So
no, this is. Oh yes, sorry. This is Swedish. This is Swedish. Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. So this is actually a bisyllabic object pronoun. So that's longer, precisely because of that. But there's. I don't get the reading that there should be someone else.
Okay, thank you.
But these things are very are difficult. But once you discover that the clearly unstressed pronouns are there, then you can start looking at the prosodic patterns and see that they're actually there also in other cases where it's maybe impossible to hear.
So first of all, thank you for a very nice lecture. It was really very interesting, and these were exactly the points we are working on. Mm-hmm. And what was very interesting for me, it was the long-distance preposing in Swedish. And I have the feeling that when I look at your examples, there is a certain group of verbs there which is common, and these are verbs of saying and thinking. It's often in your examples or modal verbs. So when I see, for example, 22, there is long distance preposing in a structure with a verb to think. 23, to know, them, know I, not, and so on. 24, they want to go to sauna, and so. And I have the feeling that there are certain structures where the borders between clauses are really closed. And this is not the case of these verbs of saying, thinking, and modal verbs. And it is easier to cross the border between clauses if we have these verbs there. This is just such a small remark.
Have you read Naomi Erteshik-Shir's thesis on bridge verbs?
No, I haven't.
So I pointed to Erteshik-Shir before. She's a Danish Israeli linguist. Her thesis from 1973 was the first, I think, to point out that you have these extractions in Danish in her case. But the thesis is mainly on what types of verbs allow extractions across them. And she called them bridge verbs. And she has maybe not in the thesis, but in later work she has developed the idea that the propositions expressed in the matrix clause and in the embedded clause are sort of merged together a bit. It's hard, as you said, it's hard to distinguish them, and it has to do with scope of quantifiers, and then that it's hard to find a clear cutoff. So yes, I don't think it's an accident that it's precisely these.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just think of your questions, and I will, in the meantime, I will just say some observations. I also would follow Sylvia in her what she said. I agree with you in whatever you have said. My observations are only very, very minor. So one of them is that it seemed to me in the first part of your talk that the examples with the pronoun position, it was a contrastive position at least it seemed to me, given by the fact that what followed was a negation. In most of the sentences which you quoted, there was a negative continuation, so they not this but something else, or this but not something else. So it seemed to me that I would speak about a contrastive topic, but then you, at the end, you also use the term contrastive topic. So it's
so
just.
No, so I think contrastive topics are. I'd like to see them as instances of Downish's hypertheme, and they come either when there's already introduced, from the context that there are several instances, and you have to say something about more than one instance, or precisely by stressing the initial phrase, you can bring about. You can tell the listener that this isn't the only thing for which this applies. I agree. So that's fine. But they are in minority in my data.
Mm-hmm.
But you're absolutely right. They often correlate with a presence of negation.
Yeah. Yeah. And when I tried to translate the examples into Czech, I would use the long pronoun. I mean, we have the stressed and unstressed pronouns in some particular cases. We have a difference between the form of a short pronoun and a long pronoun. And this long pronoun form, at least in our theory, would indicate would be used either in the focus part, so you can use the pronoun in the focus part of the sentence, but it will be the long one or the short one, or you can use this in the contrastive topic position. And that would be again the long one. Actually, this observation served as a motivation for our postulation of contrastive topic, because what we want to say is that in this contrastive topic position, we would have the long pronoun.
So
of course.
Do you think?
Sorry.
Would it be similar to the use of the demonstrative in Dutch and German?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So that is the real difference between those languages and the Scandinavian, is that we don't use the demonstrative in those cases. We use the plain personal pronoun.
But then, of course, there is a question whether this, what we call the contrastive topic, is not focus. So some people who speak about a double focus, or the focus which may be at the beginning and at the end, and the topic in between. So we try to test it in a very, I would even say primitive way, but still, on the F0 line curve, when the sentences are pronouns. And we did some study, and it was, well, if I can say that the studies confirmed, because they were only few, but still they indicated that these two positions are different, that the F0 of the contrastive topic, I mean F0 if the item is in the contrastive topic is different from F0 if this item were at the focus position. So it's very similar to Christine Bartel's conclusions that one can speak about contrastive topic and contrastive focus and focus as different kinds of contrast.
I think for Germanic that's true as well, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So that was it. I mean, another thing which we have just.
So how would you in Czech? How would you the first little dialogue? How would you say that? I mean, no preposing or.
You mean the first one? Well, as I said, the long and short distinction is in certain types of pronouns. So with demonstrative, I can't do it, the personal pronoun. So I would have to change the car into something like when met you, your first husband, and then I would say jeho jsem neviděl, or jeho jsem viděl, at those things. Him I saw. That would be long pronoun. Or you can have it in the second position as a clitic, and then I would say neviděl jsem ho.
Okay.
And then
so
it would not be a contrastive.
If I had a Czech paraphrase here, it's the second one that corresponds to the Swedish example.
Yeah. Sasha wanted to say something?
Thank you. I remember your work with Eric Valdouvy in 1990s, and I wonder if you have formalized anything that you've talked about today, or have ambition in some formal linguistic theory, or if I guess it's discourse rather than syntax already, right?
Yes. No, I don't. I haven't written anything which contains, let's say, a more explicit formalization here. I will just repeat one thing I said, and that is something I don't want to do. I don't want to link a syntactic position to a particular discourse function. I hope I haven't said. Yeah. So I've talked about the Vorfeld, basis, and I've talked about what functions elements can have there, and they can be topics entering into different kinds of chains, and they can be contrastive topics, but they can also be reams. And that's my current. So I want to distinguish the syntactic position from discourse functions. I think you need to do that in Germanic languages. Otherwise, you're yeah. I think you're going.
I think you have to do it in Czech too.
Right. Yeah. No, I think some of the confusion in the terminology is because people don't make that distinction clear.
And it's a really a mess. Okay. So, thank you, Rheem, most heartily for your talk, and we are very happy to have you with us, and I hope that we can continue our discussion in a small group of people who work on discourse relations. Then we can have a further exchange.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for